what they were doing when it started.
Bye.
I was going to say we need to remember. Then I realized that we're not all the same age. Some of us need to remember, and others of us need to become aware that folks back in the 40s and 50s and 60s were not living underground. And it was a time of very special awareness because World War II, for the first time really, meant that black people were being enlisted into the armed forces of this country to go overseas to other countries to fight for what was being called democracy. And they were making this fight, supposedly, to make the world safe for democracy. Chuck McDew, who was one of the early heads of SNCC, used to say when he would go to his rhetorical thing at meetings, he'd say, but the question was who was going to make democracy safe for the world? Because democracy here was not safe for a lot of people. But my point is that we were not living in a vacuum. And the folks who came back from the war were very conscious of the fact that they were coming back to a society that was not free, and they had risked their lives, and a great many had lost their lives, supposedly to make democracy in these other countries. Now that laid a new foundation here, number one. Number two, after the Second World War, the colonial system that these same governments, European and American, had been controlling for so long was beginning to come apart as a result of the grassroots movements that had developed in those countries. India was one of the biggest countries in the world. It had gained its independence from England, which was the biggest colonial power in the world at that time, as a result of the nonviolent struggle that had been led by Gandhi, and which was well known all around the world. Okay? And then in the 50s and especially in the early 60s, a great many African countries were beginning to get their independence from the colonial powers through these same kinds of struggles, often violent. And the same was going on in Asia. In fact, the Vietnam struggle for independence began in the 40s against the French, and then started up with the Americans in the 50s, and eventually wound up, of course, what we call the Vietnam War in the 60s and early 70s. So all of this was going, and South Africa was going through all of this process during that time. It was well known here, and people in this country began to identify with the struggles that were going on in other countries, and were asking themselves the question, if they can do it there, why can't we do it here? And I just address all of that to this question that you were asking.
What about the role of the nationalists like Marcus Garvey and other resistors who raised the consciousness of the masses of people by, the Back to Africa movement, by just saying, we define who we are. So I think that risk takers like Marcus Garvey and others, that was a real important part of our history because they never sort of let the whole idea of black liberation or the black liberation movement sort of die. There were always resistors among us who would take a stand and take a position.
Do young people know who you're talking about? When you say Marcus Garvey? All right.
Oh,
Tell a little bit about that.
step up. We didn't hear that, Joseph.
I'll let you go ahead. It's a
Part of Harlem
Joseph.
Renaissance.
Joseph.
He's part of Harlem Renaissance.
Part of Harlem Renaissance.
He wanted most black Americans to move back to Africa.
He was a great miner. A newspaper, what's the name of his newspaper?
If y'all know
He was from Barbados, but he was oppressed and enslaved here.
Why would he want people to move back to?
He believed that Africa was the motherland and that our back nations go back and take over.
Did he think democracy was working over here?
They both said the same
And-
thing.
Pardon?
I was just saying they both said the same thing.
What do you think he said?
What was it called? Johnny, what did you say?
I was just over here, I just made a comment that you were answering and Joseph was answering, y'all said the same thing, you said it two different ways.
Yeah.
That's all.
And he's also the one that framed the phrase, what is it in my kitchen? The memory's gone. He believed in the colors black, green, and red. Of course, the black represent the people, red for the struggle for blood,
Forever forward,
green
backwards,
for
never.
land, one God, what is it? One God. Yeah, one God, one destiny. You see it on plates. You see it a lot of, out of the Caribbean, is one God, one destiny. Marcus Garvey was the one who coined that phrase.
I think one of the things that's important for us to see here is the need to be connected and how we can learn from one another and the importance of not being isolated and confined. Because when people in other areas began to communicate with us, and we began to see the plight and the struggle of other people in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, having to deal with various problems, then we could instantly see ourselves and relate that to us. And especially when we had been brainwashed about going into the military and defending our country. And looking at how people were treated, how things went on in other parts of the world, and having to be brought back to where we were from. In reality, I think a lot of ways that said to black people, something is not right, about this. And that gave motivation to people to want to do something.
My brother-in-law, who was a part of World War II, made the comment to me that one of his biggest struggles and the biggest reality moment he ever faced was that a person of German descent was able to come to America and buy a home where he couldn't buy one. And, this was America's enemy. This is who we fought. But they could come and buy a house in a community, and he wasn't allowed to go there. So, it was a huge awakening for those men who went and fought for what's supposed to have been democracy in our country, and to find out that the enemy had more rights in their country than they did.
You want to draw it even more starkly. German prisoners of war, German soldiers who were brought to this country were treated better in the South than folks from the South were being treated.
That's right.
And that got a lot of people pretty mad.
Yes, it did. But I think that was a period of that truly was a period of awakening when you actually out there putting your life on the line. And you talked about the guy in Hattiesburg, Vernon Damon, whose son had to come from Vietnam to bury his parents. after the Klan raided and shot them, killed them in their home. So, you know, we've had some pretty powerful motivators.
And brothers began to say, if I can go over in this country, another country, and risk my life,
They wasn't scared no more.
you know, in the name of democracy, for the sake of this country, then I should have a right to enjoy some of the privileges that other Americans are enjoying here in this country. And I'm not going to sit down and I'm not going to take it lightly. Begin to stand up and do something about it. Do we have the same kind of things happening today?
Sure do.
In what way?
In all ways.
Tell me.
I'm saying from the legal respect, from the education respect, from just all the way around. Because I was sharing with the group that I was in that even when it comes to jobs, the job market, regardless of whether you have the education or the skills or not, you still can be overlooked because they're not looking for the most educated nor the most qualified. They're looking for the most suited. And suited to whom? You know, so it still is an ongoing struggle. You still have to fight to struggle in order to maintain and to get what is due anyway. You know, and you always have to voice that. And as far as home, yeah, they give you home, but they give you something that they don't want to live in either. Then they give it to you in the worst part of town. They give you a shell and say that, okay, 10 kids can live here. So it's still the same thing. They come along with the first-time home buyers, and that's a laugh as well because people are not educated to the extent that this is for helping you with the foreclosure and what have you, and you don't have to go out and rush in order to get this. This is something that you can sit up in the bank until the time comes that you can actually get a home. You understand what I'm saying? So in every aspect that we have made defeat and became victory over, they end up putting another stipulation in there. Whereas it's fine for you to go out there and to get a loan, and you know, and you owe X amount of debtors. I can be like the same and come in and apply for the same loan, and these people don't even have jobs, and I maintain the jobs.
Two things stick out in my mind right away, and that's what in August of 1966, President Clinton signed. 1996, Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Reconciliation Act, which is in essence welfare reform. And that act pretty much says that welfare recipients must be personally responsible for now after years of being, receiving benefits. No one has access necessarily to benefits, that they must go out and work. And of course, in this state and in most states, there are no jobs that pay living wage. The state government then does not provide child care for moms to go out so that they can work. And especially in Mississippi, when it comes to jobs, most of those jobs are factory, maybe chicken or poultry factory. So residents living in Holmes County, for example, will need to travel to Carthage or some other place to work. So there's a contradiction in what the federal government sort of wants people to do, but what they're also willing to do. And the other thing that comes to mind immediately is the child health insurance program. The state gave to the federal government, gave to each state so much money to insure all the uninsured children of the working poor. The state legislature, our state representatives, then gave that responsibility to a commission to decide what that insurance program will look like. And although there may be some people of color on that commission, those people that sit on that commission to make that decision or make those decisions won't necessarily have our children's interests in mind. And there are no working poor sitting at that table. So those are two national policies that were made within the last year that impacts our lives in such a way that, it will have devastating effects on our communities.
Long standards.
We, as in reflecting back a little bit, we talked about how people have gone into World War II and how the Germans and all was treated. But I would like for us, you know, as a party note before lunch and dinner, is to think about what is happening to us today in this present time with all of the brothers and sisters who was a part of the Vietnam War, brothers and sisters that was a part of the war in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
Right. And what is happening about that situation. Because if we look very carefully, we can see the same kinds of things that is happening right now. Because I do know in a lot of instances where the Vietnamese in particular, who have come over into this country, is being set up with homes in some cases,
Everything.
businesses, you know, cars, places to stay, the whole thing. So we can see a similar kind of reoccurrence of that situation happening. We're going to break right now for lunch and dinner. And we need some help in setting up rooms where we can eat.
One man freedom, one man freedom now. One man freedom, one man freedom, one man freedom. One man freedom, one man freedom now. One man freedom, one man freedom, one man freedom. Educate. One man freedom, one man freedom now. One man freedom, one man freedom, one man freedom. Educate. One man freedom, one man freedom now. I'll demonstrate. One man freedom, one man freedom, one man freedom. I'll demonstrate. One man freedom, one man freedom now. I'll overcome fear. One man freedom, one man freedom, one man freedom. I'll overcome fear. One man freedom, one man freedom now.
Good people. We know it's hot.
Yes, it is.
We know we're all dragging our butts. It's 85 in here and so on. But we got to do the best we can. And for those of you who can't remember, there was a time when we didn't have air conditioning.
Oh, really?
And there was a time when we didn't have air conditioning in our meetings. Right?
And there
We
was
just-
times when we didn't even have window fans.
Really?
Right.
Now you done went way back.
I remember the window fan.
We had ceiling fans over here.
We use pasteboard boxes, pieces of pasteboard boxes.
So instead of feeling sorry for ourselves and being down in the mouth about it, let's just pretend it's cool. So cool in here, you're wondering when you're going to go get your jacket, right? And you feeling cooler already? Yes, you need to. It's all in the mind. It's cool. And it's verging on cold. And sooner or later, one of you is going to say, maybe we better turn the air conditioning down. But we're going to tough it out. Okay? Now, we want to give you some feedback. But I gotta ask you to be in, either we're gonna be in the conversation together, or we gotta break up and have different conversations, okay? Because it's very difficult to do.
We want y'all to be a part of this.
Right. Okay. Now, we've been, you know, this is an experiment. We've not done a 5-day thing before, and we've not attempted to cover in as much depth some of these subjects. So we're learning from it, and it's very important for us to learn together. One of the things that we were talking about over lunch, as an observation on our part, is that each of these segments that we've been doing in terms of the stages of domination and control don't necessarily have to have the same amount of time applied to it. And the reason I was thinking that is that I think that the second stage of domination control and segregation really needs to be seen in 2 parts rather than 1. It's not a matter of the length of time, because actually the first stage went on for a much longer period of time, over 200 years. And the second stage is about 100 years. Actually more than 200, about 250 years in the first stage. But the second stage really is 2 facets to it. The first part from the 1870s to the 1940s really was more focused on survival than it was on struggle. There was struggle. There was a lot of struggle, but it was more about survival than struggle. The second period, from the 1940s to the 1960s and 70s, is much more about struggle in terms of where the emphasis and focus is than it is about survival. And therefore, there are shifts in the way people look at things, the way people react to things, and therefore what the community does in order to advance its goals as defined in the vision. Is that making any sense? Mm-hmm. That's why you need to see it in 2 parts. These things don't come like opening doors and shutting doors, you know. All of a sudden it's one way and then another. There are always transitions and great overlap between the 2, but you can see the shift. And understanding, remember we were talking about how important it is to see the whole picture, right? When you see the elements emerging in each of the different aspects of society. And sometimes it's difficult to calculate how much weight to give to any one of these things. But what's really important to do is not to underestimate the significance of any of these things. And why do I say that? Because in looking back, if you can't tell exactly, but you know all of these things played a part, then you also need to understand that in terms of looking forward. It is not possible to know in advance what it is that's really going to become one of the most significant things that get done. You can only find that out afterwards, right? Don't underestimate the work that people do, you know, in any given situation. Part of the problem of the way we are taught and the way we are trained in colleges and elsewhere is to look for the big moment, the big event, the thing. What's the event that you study probably more than any other or learn about more than any other during the whole 1960s period? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
The March on Washington.
The March on Washington in, you know the date?
63.
63. And what's the big thing that happened at the March on Washington?
I have a dream.
I have a dream speech, right? And you must see it 50, if you watch television, it must be on 50 times a week. On this advertisement and that advertisement, there's always the clip of King's face coming up, and you hear the voice, right? And it's used in 1,000 ways now to symbolize this, that, or the other thing. okay? But the March on Washington, in and of itself, was not one of the most significant events of that period. And it accomplished next to nothing. Well, now, wait a minute. Is that right?
Nope.
No, it isn't right.
It mobilized.
Because it created a symbolic value, right? And it became a basis off of which you could play all kinds of stuff, right? It's hard to calculate. All depends on who's looking at it as you turn that diamond, right? What facet you want to emphasize. So we could argue from now till doomsday about that. And we might both be right, even if we disagree. Depends on the perspective you're bringing to it. So one of the things we were thinking about is that in the future, when we do this, we need to break this into two parts so that we can get a true understanding of how things emerged in the first part and how they emerged in the second. And we can give more focus in the second part to a keener understanding of how the movement grew, how a movement grows. It has strengths and weaknesses. Mistakes are made. And even out of mistakes, good things can happen. In the view of many who were involved at the time, one of the most significant efforts that was made is written in the history books as a losing effort. And that was the Albany, Georgia bus boycott, which was organized by the Albany movement with assistance from both SNCC and from SCLC, and was on the TV all over the world, went on for 2 years, right? And if you see the interviews with, wasn't it Pritchett who was the mayor? You know, he will brag, he doesn't quite brag, but he's bragging about how clever he was in defeating the effort to desegregate the buses because of the strategy and tactics that he used to prevent the Albany movement from being successful. And yet, the Albany movement effort did more to push the movement forward everywhere in the South by the courage and by the example and by the modeling which people did in making the sacrifices they did in Albany to generate the emergence of work everywhere. Chief of Police, okay. I'm sorry. I can't remember who was there. Yeah, that's right. Okay. But I remember our talking in SNCC about understanding the Albany situation, because the lesson to be learned from it was that there are different kinds of successes, the different kinds of purposes to work, and that we need to understand all of them in assessing whether to do something, whether to continue to do something, what its value is, even if you can't win that particular fight, if you appear not to win it.
And even with the March on Washington, those that was a part of the initial concept and organizing, based on what the initial intent was about, the March on Washington was an utterly failure because it wasn't about what actually went on. It was about something else. People organized or mobilized themselves all around the country to go to Washington, D.C. to shut the government down until the government made concessions. And that's why you could say it was relatively easy, because people all across the country could relate to the government needing to do something. and we can shut them down until they move on some of these needs, I'm willing to be a part of that. However, a lot of other things came into being where, quote unquote, big leaders took over and changed it. But even though, based on what it set out to do, it was a failure, we can look at all of the benefits that came out of that, similar to the way, as Mike said, we can also look at the Albany moves. And clearly, as Mike is saying, there is a distinction between that earlier period and this latter period that we're talking about. Some of us may have heard, as a part of our culture, coming out of our communities, where people will say, I'm surviving, I'm existing, I'm struggling just to survive. Meaning that there's a question as to whether you will actually survive or not. And there were many people that wasn't sure during that period of time as to whether we would survive. But after a certain period of time, it was not so much a question as to whether we are going to be able to survive. But since we are surviving and existing, what it is that we can do, how we should go about doing things to make our survival more pleasant and to move from a state of just survival to a better quality of life.
In your work, let me back up a step. See if I can say what I have in my mind. I don't know if I can do it. If you do work in your community, in which your work really kind of rolls from day to day in reaction to what's going on with people in the community from day to day, and you have no plan, and it's not, that work is not flowing out of a vision of where you need to wind up with this work, you can become very frustrated by what appears to be a sequence of rejection by those from whom you're trying to negotiate something. Whether it's a school board, or a city council, or a county board of supervisors, or the police department, or the court system. If you see your work in what I would call mechanical terms of Annie Noel needs something from her superintendent, and Velma and Betty are going to help Annie do that, and the superintendent says no, or like they told you yesterday, Drew and Ms. Robinson, I'm not even going to bother to answer your questions. I have nothing but contempt for you, right? If your measure of your work is, I ask and they refuse, you can get depressed and say, I don't understand how to succeed in this work. I don't know how to make this work happen. But if the strategic thinking out of which you're operating is that I need to find a way to help people in the community understand that our superintendent is arrogant, insensitive, has no regard for us, so that they can understand what is happening to them and to their children, then the confrontation with the superintendent accomplished that, right? Because he demonstrated his arrogance and his insensitivity, and you created an opportunity for people to learn from that. So in that one session, you actually employed 4 elements of community organizing. One is the investigation, right? You need to find out whether or not he is going to be responsive or is going to be arrogant. 2, you need to share that information with other people in the community, internally with your community, externally with others. You have people from the community there, they see what you see. So there's investigation and education. In addition, that is a step in the negotiation process with your own community, right? Because you got to negotiate their participation, and they need to feel as angry as you feel by being treated as badly as you've been treated. It's not enough for you to go there, you need them to be there to feel, to see, to hear the same things. And then it's not your word against the superintendent, they have seen it for themselves, okay? And 4, you've demonstrated your willingness to overcome the fear and take the risk of going up against and confronting the superintendent on these issues. You've also demonstrated that you've put together information with which to challenge the superintendent, right? And with which to confront him, and that you put together the appropriate questions for which you're demanding answers, right? So you could come away saying, yes, it was a terrific meeting, if you wanted to, if you saw the work in that context. So if the question in 1962 was, how do we get the whole country to understand that in these communities, the people who are in power continue to act in this outrageous and immoral way toward black folks who are trying to exercise the most fundamental and basic human rights, such as getting on a bus and going from point A to point B like anybody else, and after all, what's the big deal, right? Then they accomplished that in 1962. They investigated, educated, negotiated, and demonstrated with the whole country, right? And rather than seeing it as a defeat, it was really a tremendous victory. Because that was only, like in a war, you know, you battle for hill number 57, and if you can get 57, maybe you can move on to hill 98. Or if you lose 57, you might have to retreat to hill 211. Albany was a hill where there were a lot of casualties. But as a result of the fight that was engaged in on Hill 98 over there in Albany, very quickly, the rest of the war, in terms of bringing down legalized segregation, was won. Because in 2 years, that was outlawed in the '64 Civil Rights Act. In only 2 years, right? What had been in place since the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, was brought down in 2 years from the time of that battle. So was that battle an important staging area in the war? Because it changed public thinking, helped to change public thinking about that? Yes. In the same way that the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, in which the Viet Cong took extraordinary casualties, was the turning point in the war for the Vietnamese, because it changed American thinking on whether they were going to continue to support the Vietnam War and put resources and put their children into that war. Because it exposed the vulnerability of the United States militarily, which the United States had never ever believed it could be, especially against a little country, you know, 6,000 miles away. So we need to incorporate into our thinking how this works. Because this applies to Drew, it applies to Duck Hill, it applies to Indianola, it applies wherever you're working. South Carolina, in Holmes County, and what you are doing in Duck Hill can affect what's going on in Drew and in Holmes County. And what's going on in Holmes County can affect what's going on in Drew and in Duck Hill and in Indianola and so on. So you need, in that sense, you also need to see the opportunity that comes from your connectedness. And what we're doing in Mississippi can affect what's going on in South Carolina and vice versa if we keep the lines of communication open and we see the opportunities to support each other. Because that's what happened in the sit-in movement. Really, people sprang up and started doing stuff all over in support of the things that were going on elsewhere. I mean, if my memory is right, that was part of the atmosphere and the spirit of stuff. We have to show our support for the folks who got arrested over in such and such place. Sometimes you held demonstrations about that. Sometimes you went and did what they did to show your support in that way. You did it in your community.
As Mike said, initially it was in the spirit of showing support and solidarity for folks otherwhere. And then after a point, people realized that, hey, we have actually began a process to break down and tear down the walls of that same thing that exists right here within our community. So now, rather than us looking so much as in support of what other folks are doing in their area, we look at what we can be doing and need to be doing in support of ourselves right here, deal with the injustice that we're facing, not just in support of what other folks are doing.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What happens when you have in your community, and this may not be the time to ask, if it's not, you can just tell me, but what happens in your community when your community is one, but you can see through, when you start learning things for yourself, you can see so clearly that your community is divided into two by the same system that's doing you the injustice. And what I'm saying is, in the Duck Hill area, like in our school system, we have two schools, but the superintendent so strongly favors one school that they think that this is okay what he's doing because the other school is suffering. And you can't get this half of the community to see that this is what's happening, that it's wrong, and that it keeps reoccurring. And when the other side can see so clearly what's happening, and it's dividing the community, and you're trying with all you have, and they just won't come over and meet you any kind of way, because he keeps feeding them this what looks like it's sweet, when you know that it's not sweet. It's just him misusing them to keep you in your place. And really, you don't have no place.
The only problem I have with responding now is that take us down a trail that, it's not like there's a 60-second kind of, this is it. That's a very, very important question about how to think through your work, but that's an hour.
I ask because the more I work with SouthernEcho, when you start learning, when you go back into your community, your eyes are open where you were once blind, and I will. But
The thing about it is that, this is where a whole lot of this thing about where we've come from, what it took to get you to this point. Was it the fact that everybody supported your dream and helped, facet to the words that you were speaking about? I think the thing that I would say in a case like that, this is where people have to know where it is that they've come from and what it took to get to this point. And in terms of the level of, it wasn't where you was, it was that the fact that you was having the same identical problem that I was having. Whether it was housing, whether it was the workplace, whether it was, money and finance or whatever, we was all having the same problem. But now the picture is so dynamic. Look, the stuff that happened in Texas, the stuff that happened in Mississippi, the stuff that's happening in Alabama, all over the country. We are so individuals. They have taught us to not to think and to buy into, if you just work, if you had an education, if you had a master's degree, all these ifs. And then when you go and get this ifs, then you still got another ifs. But I think the thing is that we got to be able to tell folks, or show how it is that you've gotten to where you is, and that why people should be buying into supporting the whole ethic of awareness.
Well, what Drew is asking is, look, in our situation, half of our community expresses disinterest in our problem because they're being paid off by the white community by being given a better school situation than we're being given. And to throw just a comment at that without it being, a complete thought, I think what incorporates what you're talking about with their situations is that you have to make an assessment of what you've got to work with and start with that as the reality and figure out how strategically to take advantage of that, recognizing, because you're looking back at the historical process, that there have been many situations in which just a few people have been able to make a very successful impact on the process because they thought it through in a way that figured out how to work with what they had rather than wishing that they had something else. Because right now you don't have Kilmichael on your side, but you haven't really successfully organized in Duck Hill yet and taken advantage of the resources you have there. You're hoping that if Kilmichael would just come through, it would solve your problem. And that's wishful.
But see,
I guess what brings me to the edge of my seat is I feel the pain of urgency, because what we're looking at is they've closed our high school. We saw it happen right before our eyes. They've now taken the 7th and 8th grade. We know what we're in store for if we don't do something in the next 12 months.
I'm agreeing with you that it's urgent, and that's why you have to take advantage of what you've got, rather than trying to build a plan around what you don't have. And you don't have Kilmichael. You've got only Duck Hill to work with.
Also, this ties directly into what Corey was saying. Even within your county, it's important for us to know how we got to be where we are right now. Because when you study even the history of Montgomery County and how the folks in the Kilmichael area raised all kind of hell, etc., then that gives you some understanding as to how they got to where they are now. But it also ties back into some of the things that we talked about. When we were the white folks, this is exactly the kinds of things that we talked about us doing, right? When we were the white folks earlier, this is exactly one of the kinds of things that we talked about doing. So we understand that they're going to be doing that. But that's why it's so important for us to understand that, do our investigation to understand how we got to where we are today, and develop that vision, and have other people to buy into that vision as a result of our educating and negotiating. And once they buy into that, then it's not mine, but it is our vision. Because we all have bought in to it, and now it's a matter of us developing a strategy and a program of work for us to bring that vision that we have all bought into the process. And there's no set, this is the one way, because what works in one area may not work in another area, but we can use a system, a process that we go through in doing it. And that's why we constantly talk about the different elements of organizing and going through that process based around a common vision that, as a part of implementing our strategy and our program of work, we ultimately get there. And it's not going to be easy, because we know who we're dealing with, you know. And to give us a little bit better understanding is that when we fell in that same frame of mind ourselves, you know, we knew how adamant we were, you know, in our role playing. So that's how we got to look at it, and that's how we have to move from where we are to where we need to go and determine how we're going to get there.
I think the other thing is that we got to take people not out of their experience, but take them from where they have some experience at. And I think that it has to be about bringing folks back to remembrance, if I use this word. Bringing folks back to remembrance. See, we become so tolerant that we'll tolerate most anything. You know, we're tolerant now. That's what we are now. But see, if you can do marriage children.
What you mean by tolerant is reluctant to confront.
Right. We can, and because we can escape it in so many ways, and never have to face our fears, even though it exists, because we don't have to face it, because we have avenues, we have others that we can escape our reluctancies and never face the reality. And that's what folks are most dealing with. They have this tolerance that would allow them to be relaxed, to go into a mode of, why not let us allow them to do this? Because see, because we got this now. You see what I'm saying? And they never have to face that kind of fear. But see, if they do our children like this, then we'll do this. It ain't talking about challenging and saying, no, we're going. I mean, the fact of I want to sit in the white man's cafe in 1960. Hell, we could have went and bid on our own, but they say no. See what I'm saying? They didn't went and done something else. They didn't went and create another. They said we want to sit in your place. They didn't say, oh no, we could ride on the back of the bus. They said, no, we want to sit in the front of the bus. See, now we got this mode of, we don't have to tolerate that. We can go and do it another way. And that's what people are doing. You're going back into a world of tolerance. And until this whole debate about school reform, vouchers, not dealing with the problem, now we're talking about escaping the problem. You see what I'm saying? The whole idea now is how can we escape our problem? It's not about dealing with the problem. It's about how you escape the problem and allow people to be themselves, because you're making me feel uncomfortable.
But I hear you. But when I think about our community, you know, what I'm seeing is not an escaping type of problem, but it's a thing where white folks have come in and they actually have a handful of this and a handful of that, which are the same, but somehow they condition some black people's mind to make them think that this is better than what you have over here when they can't see the true picture. This is the same thing. You just been served on a gold plate, and I'm served on a white plate, but they both glass. They're both still bright.
But you now see, don't you, that this is a part of this continuing historical pattern, and you have to break that pattern. But now this is not the session for us to take Duck Hill's vision, strategy, and program of work and put it together. But that you know that what's happening is normal, and that you can beat it if you do it well, right? And that's what you need to focus on. But you shouldn't be surprised, and you don't need to be anguished anymore, because you now know that this is nothing different than what white folks have been trying to do since forever, right?
And you also know that if they are serious about maintaining their domination and control, they are supposed to try to do it.
But let's make the transition to the next segment, which is for us to be talking about what are the remnants, because this is a good transition to that. What are the remnants of the slave system that affect our work today in our communities? And this is not only about Duck Hill, it's about all of our communities.
And I'd like to, if we will, because a lot of the young folks did a lot of discussion in a lot of the small groups. So I'd like, if we would, to have some of the young folks to start out telling us about some of the remnants, of slavery, of segregation, that still today affects the work that we're trying to do in our community. What are some of the things that still exist as a carryover from segregation or from slavery that affects the work we're trying to do today? All right, well, Matt.
From segregation, we got fear, that was fear, old folks, when you try to work, we still scared to go to white man, somebody else might say.
So you're saying back in slavery on through the period of segregation, the white man instilled fear into us. And that fear today is still around. And because of it being around today, it's affecting the work that we have to do today. That,
segregation. White people always better things in life, and you got black people still holding back and being afraid to speak out in front of white people.
okay.
It's hot tea because it's cold.
In my community, it's like a lack of education because kids that stay on the right side, they go to locker, they got a better education than we do. And like back in the days when school segregated, the white kids, I guess, had better materials than the black kids. And in my community, it's still that way now because we still getting books from them and the hand-me-down books and all that kind of stuff. That's what I think.
Okay.
Someone else? What you say? What you about to say?
If I can see it, I can believe it. I said, you got R. Kelly singing it. if I can see it, I don't believe it. I can move, I can fly, you know, nigga, okay? So we're still talking about the women that affecting our work that we're doing today. White people think that they're better than the black. Do blacks think white folks are better than no. Some blacks. Okay. So then, so you're saying during segregation and back in slavery time, white folks taught the black folks that white folks was better. And you're saying still today, there are some of our people who still feel like the white folks is better than the black folks. Some black folks. No, I'm not talking about all. That's what I say some. And that affects the work that we're doing.
We had to be the white folks always had the best stuff they had. It was so hard to live in it.
I didn't hear.
I see. Then white folks always had better things than black people, and they were so hard for them to get anything. That's part of why they think that white folks are better than them.
Okay.
Someone, you were about to say something. Right.
Remnants left over from segregation. There's a lot about that stamp of inferiority. I think lots of us still carry it around. Sometimes it comes out in our messages. For example, you have the mentality of feeling happen to wear dreadlocks. And so sometimes you will hear people talk about, if you straighten your hair, it would be longer. That's a contradiction. My hair is just one straight, you're not. So sometimes I think, that, you have to have your hair straight. That's a carryover from slavery and segregation in terms of whether or not people of color, especially women, choose to wear their hair straight because society say your hair must be combed. That's one of the remnants I think we carry over. Even in terms of when we dress in African style, we still call Africans good people. So I think a lot of that is carried over from slavery and segregation.
So why do we call Africans them people?
Because we don't see a connection. We don't see that the blood that runs through our veins connects us to, actually the blood that runs through African veins also runs through our veins. And somehow we don't see the connection because our images of Africa for most of us came through watching Tarzan movies. And whenever you saw Tarzan movies, Africans were always defeated. There was a white boy Tarzan that went in, and no matter how many Africans Tarzan would get into a fight, but Tarzan would come out the big guy. He would even jump in the lake and kill the alligator. We notice that's not like it. So a lot of that comes from media, and it is very much a part of who we are. It comes from the media's image of how they painted people of color and how we buy into that, and never objected anyway.
I think a perfect example is Hollis came to the Howard Community Center and talked about his vision to South Africa. And folks were asking those questions about the jungle. I mean, in 1997, 97, when did you go to South Africa?
I went in '96, but the conversation was in
97, right. It was like, you sure that's what it is? I just came now.
Y'all know.
Yeah, but see, the reason for that was that we was taught to believe that if a light-skinned person went to Africa, they would kill them or eat them. So we had went under the assumption that light-skinned people could not go to Africa. But it's okay for a dark-skinned person to go to Africa. These are the things that we taught.
I think it's basically stereotyping. People projecting how things are and the way things should be.
controlling what's being taught as far as education, because even now in the school, even in the actual school classroom, they're still not being taught the true characteristics of Africa. They're still not being taught history as it relates to black people.
And still
Because
saying that we're
from
evolving from
segregation,
apes
right.
towards evolution instead of teaching from a biblical standpoint.
Because from segregation, white people have controlled what was being taught to us, and to what extent and how it was to be taught, and they're still controlling that now.
And I think also too, one that is still carried over, that, you know, even with our parents today, coming up, they would always, they had to say yes, you always have to say yes ma'am and no sir to white folks. And it's hard for them to me, of some of the ones I've come in contact with, it's hard for them to see and understand now that you don't have to say yes ma'am and no ma'am, or yes sir and no sir to white folks. Because we talk about the thing of respect. In order to get respect, you have to get it. And they want us to say, you know, the yes and the no, yes sir and no sir to them.
I think another remedy to suffer from segregation is that when a member of the African American community step forward to provide leadership, we see them as being, quote, uppity niggas, because that's what white folks have told us about people who challenge the status quo and ask questions and challenge white folks. You know, when we start to challenge white folks, then we're labeled by white folk and black folk as uppity niggas. So I still think some of that's left over when we step up to take leadership in our own community, then we're being seen as that uppity nigga, you know, and we're taught not to follow that uppity nigga. So I think that's left over, and it keeps us from doing work, because the moment we begin to step up, even our peers and our friends, you know, they put out that, you know, you think you're something, you want to take over and all this stuff, and I think those are clearly remnants that's left over from segregation.
Well, one of the things that's left over that's very powerful, and bugs the hell out of me, and y'all tell me about this all the time, and some people have said it to my face. Something isn't true until a white person tells you it's true. Now, that's devastating, because it gives white folk control over what is defined as real or not real, or what we can't know until the magic moment happens and you get to hear from the right person. However untruthful or wrongful it may be. But that gives people the power to confuse, simply by saying, I don't agree with that. White person says, I don't agree with that. Whoa, hold up. Stop the presses, you know, stop the train. Can't move forward.
And one of the other things that is happening is that you take like the work that we do now, versus like then, some of your family members will come to you, and once they realize and understand what it is you're doing, they will try to stop you from doing it. Because the first thing they'll say, well, we don't want you to get hurt. You know, we don't need you doing it, it's okay. And said, this is not your fight. You know, they find different ways to make sure that you don't get involved. But then it's something to be within the individual where it continue to press you, saying, well, regardless of whether I have anything, what I'm saying is you don't have, regardless you have children, brothers and sisters, they don't make it okay. But then other people might find that it's not okay with you. Still, the way I say it, no black life is okay. You have to continue to press to be on the same common ground. But your family member have problems with that, including other people. They say you're crazy, you're foolish, and Lord have mercy, something else. And I say that to your and they're scared that you might get and which a lot of times you don't realize what might happen to you, but you're really listening. And then if you But they didn't have to tell me, but I was listening to what it was that was being said to me. Say, you know, since people started working, so much has changed. I said, what are you talking about? What has changed? You didn't treat me like you used to treat me. You know, I need to get this, I need to get that, without going through this and that. I said, well, maybe you might need to start speaking up, telling me what it is you think. And I said, that yes, ma'am, and no such thing don't play it out with me. Well, you have to speak yes or no, ma'am, if you want something. No, I don't think so. And see, then when you begin to speak that way, they saying that you're being nice, you're being this polite, but it doesn't make me this polite and not being nice. I'll die you for it.
I think, and then too, the thing, like Ellen said, the inferiority complex, it's like whatever they say is right, and you don't question that. Like you can't question what they're saying at all. You know, and I've never been one to just tie down and just not say anything. If it's something that I'm not getting, I'm going to ask why. And if it's not what I want, I'm going to ask for what I want. You know? And I think that sometimes it's a form of intimidation because they put that fear in, always to hold your head down, never look anyone in the eye. You know, like you're embarrassed of who you are and what you're saying. And you need to break out that mold. You know, I'm just as equal to you. Nigger in my home was never used, and if it was telling you exactly what it was. To me, anybody can be one. You know, and as far as calling people out their names and what have you, it wasn't played like that. You know, you respect everybody, regardless of color or race. And we don't run around saying yes ma'am and no ma'am just because of the gender and the color of your skin. We do it because we was raised that way, you know, and not taking anything from anybody. And I tried to rear my kids in the same manner. You know, you respect all people. Because if you want to respect, you're going to have to give that. It's not anything that someone can take from you. And I think that's a whole big issue when it comes to kids growing up. Don't teach them to be timid. You know, teach them to ask and say exactly what they want and clarify. Speak with clear understanding, you know, so people won't miss the picture. And I think that's a whole lot that was taught from slavery up until this point. People still walk around with their head down. You know, like, I know that I shouldn't be asking you this, ma'am, but sir, but, you know. And then, too, you know, it's just like going into the bank or going into any place and you wanting something and you got to be persistent. You know, if they said no, why? You know, what's wrong with me asking you why? I mean, I can't get it, and it upsets me when I think about people think that you can't do that. Like at work, I was asking, my boss had made a statement, and I said, why? He said, like, that doesn't matter. And I'm like, yes, it does matter. You know, like I shouldn't question you why you want me to do something just because you said do it. That don't make good sense. Give me an understanding, then I can see better what you want. Because people expect you to know and to assume, and I'm saying, I don't want to assume, I want to get what you're talking about.
I think another thing that's left over from segregation is this idea that children should be seen and not heard, that children have a place and they should stay in their place. And I think that's been put upon young people, or it's put upon adults, and then sort of the adults then put it upon children, that you should be seen and not heard. Therefore, you shouldn't question adults, you shouldn't challenge them in any way. You should be seen and not heard. So just sit there and don't say anything.
There's one thing that is kind of bothersome to me, which I see as a carryover from slavery and went straight on through the period of segregation and is affecting us today. And that is the faith, confidence, belief, and trust in the white folk. And they gonna make it all right. They gonna take care of it. You got a problem, we're sorry. We'll handle it. And I think in many cases today, sometimes consciously and other times subconsciously, we know we got the problem, and sometimes consciously and subconsciously we're waiting for them to fix it. Even though they have not fixed it, we still have that faith and that confidence. And it's just a matter of time. He gonna take care of it.
Not only not fix it, but they'll cause the problem first.
Absolutely.
You know, a recent experience of mine, we were talking in our group about cultural change, how white people modernize into their culture, their language, the English language, speaking the way they want to speak, and into their way of dressing and acting and even behaving. You're not accepted until you look a certain way. Ellen was talking about the dreadlocks and the straightening of the hair. The young man, Kevin, this is the most recent experience, going to youth court with him. I was dressed in what white people terms how you have to, black people see themselves as having to be dressed to even be presentable to a white person, white people, with a stocking. Right. And I was in the youth court with all of these other mothers who were there with their children. I wasn't there with my child, I was there with somebody else's child. But they were looking like we looking at the jeans, the tennis shoes, they were comfortable. They got no respect. They didn't even get recognized, some of them, when they were trying to address the court. But yet I was given free rein.
Dressed in a European attire.
Because of the way I look. So it's a carryover from segregation to have to be molded to think that we have to be accepted because we look like the white culture wants us to look.
I don't know if it's up there already, but I was going to follow up with what Hollis was saying about the faith and the confidence that white folk was going to fix everything. It was the same belief, I think, that's carried over, that you didn't have to really take up arms and fight, that just wait on the Lord. You know, that was another thing that I think still is pervasive today. A lot of people think, oh, baby, you ain't got to go out there and do all this organizing. Just wait on the Lord. The Lord is going to fix it. Pray about it. That's one. And another one is, I mean, at one point, we were denied the opportunity to learn how to read and write, you know, during slavery. And at another point, we were given handed down books and materials and stuff. But I think even still pervasive today, the masses of our people don't really like to read. And I think it all stems back from...
I wanted to piggyback on that faith and confidence thing, because I can think of my grandmother, and she just believed so much in white people. She believed them, and to make a long story short, my stepfather was beat to death in a jail and was not allowed his phone call. We found out that what happened when we picked him up that morning on the way taking him to the hospital just before he died. And the NAACP back then came in to the town to help us to investigate. My grandmother believed so strongly how good the white people had been to her. And she pleaded with my mother about how good they had been to her and how she couldn't have made it if they hadn't helped her. And she believed what she was saying. And she believed it so strong that she physically became ill because my mother was pursuing this that had happened in the jail, that my mother actually dropped her case against the city of Pontotoc because it affected my grandmother just that much, where she was literally hospitalized. She believed in it. And I guess when you get people like that, there's just no change in their mind.
One of the things we need to think about is when there's an overlap between belief and fear.
You think that that was a thing where it was fear?
No. But sometimes beliefs can screen or mask the fear and become a basis for rationalizing how you respond to something as a means of avoiding the confrontation that needs to take place. But you don't want to say, I'm afraid. You want to say, I believe X, Y, and Z is the case, and therefore I don't need to confront.
And in their hearts, they probably know the truth.
I don't know. You know,
Like,
you can be in denial big time.
But you still know the truth, that's just denial.
One of the things that I don't know.
Right, one bad fact. I can say I'm not all my life.
I don't know if anyone has mentioned this or if they already be up there. One of the things that I think in this group, Brenda probably gets the brunt of the jokes around color, because I think it is a carryover from slavery as well as a carryover from segregation, that the lighter you are in our society, in the African American community, there is more white blood in you. And I know Brenda gets the brunt of the jokes around here because I'm one of the people that calls her Nancy. You know, so that's still a carryover. I mean, that is still a carryover from slavery. That, you know, the lighter you are, we as a matter of fact, we call, you know, people with fair skin color red bone. You know, and that's a carryover from slavery, and it's a carryover from segregation. That we point out the light-skinned, fair-skinned members of our community and label them because of the amount of white blood we think that's in their skin. And that's certainly a carryover.
I've taken the abuse all my life.
I know you have. But that's a part, again, that's a part of the carryover. You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. All right, Nancy.
I think one of the other things is that, as we use the term, his ice is colder than our ice.
No, they thought ice was ice.
But I mean, you know, just talk, conversation. But I mean, the whole remedy around we're still buying, selling, and trading with the average white person on the basis of Walmart. Some of these bigger chains, we gotta go to Belts to buy our clothes. We gotta go down to the Ford company instead of, you know, maybe somebody else who made a black man who got a GM company. You know, this kind of mentality of thinking, because his prices is cheaper, and not realize that, you know, you still buying into the same system that you call yourself criticizing. You go and buy all our stuff from Belts and never go downtown. I mean, in my case, because our downtown is still surviving and the mall is about dying. But that kind of mentality, we still focusing in on that capital society, and then they'll give our folks a job based on. I mean, say like for instance, you got say educators who making say some of the basic range in the area, they still flowing into these markets of buying into their culture. And we got to live in their neighborhood to be up to par.
Let's turn the corner. You've identified remnants. How does that affect your work? How do these remnants impact the work you're trying to do in your communities? That's where you need to turn the corner and make that connection so you can see how to deal with, understand why things happen or don't happen, but also give you a basis for trying to deal with it. How does this stuff affect your work?
Well, one, you can take that one that I just mentioned right there. We can never have control over our destination as long as we're supplying them with the goods, with our goods and services. We continue to want to look good and not be what's dang doing good.
How does that affect your work?
It affects the work in terms of that you cannot see. You're still focusing on the individuals.
How does it affect your work?
Folks, they don't see the whole vision. I mean, until we.
How does that affect your work?
It probably slows down. It slows down the process of getting to where he's trying to get. When he can perhaps get there sooner, people can come to the understanding and start to invest back into their own community, build an economic base. That once you gain economic power, you also have more access to political power, to educational power. So I think it probably hinders and slows.
But you need to take the analysis all the way through that. Okay. It's not a question of whether I understand or not.
Right.
It's a question of our needing to build a common language where we can be sure that everybody understands what we're talking about as it relates to the work. And that's why I'm pushing you to specify and to pin it down and not to leave it out here, but to draw it right down.
And then I think the other part to that is that we overlook an important resource in our own community. Because when we don't invest in businesses that are right there in our community, when it comes, and I'll give you one example, like when it comes to the summer and we want youth programs, we should be going to those businesses in our community where we invest our money to say, we want you to invest in our young people this summer to sponsor a football team or a baseball team or whatever, so that money and the resources constantly flow within our own community. So when we go outside, we really don't acknowledge our own resources right there that we have under our nose.
I also think a lot of these things makes it more difficult to broaden your base of support when you still got so much fear and instilled in people, and so much of all of these other isms that still continue to affect them from way back when and yesterday. It makes it difficult to get them to come to a process where you're fighting against the system as opposed to with a system, because people fear bucking system and challenging people. I think it also makes it more difficult to negotiate with them, from a position of strength on the other side from where they're coming from. Because they have all these isms, because the ones that are so-called... Huh?
What are you referring to all these isms?
I was just trying to keep them going through all the things that have already been listed. I'm just thinking about how those things can make your work so much more difficult when you're dealing with them and broaden your base of support and negotiating with people.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to talk about briefly.
I know when I talk about skin color, when we get together, again, because we have this carryover around skin color, for many of us, we've been made to believe that, again, the lighter you are, you have some privileges. So when there is someone of fair color among us who may take a leadership role, usually we get to the side and we say, that B thinks she's something else, and who she think gonna listen to her, and she carrying on. So we usually won't even open ourselves up to listen to this person simply because that person's skin color may be a few shades lighter than ours. The person may be telling the truth, but because we have this stuff in our own head about skin color, we aren't able to put that aside to really listen to what this person is saying to us. So lots of times we miss out on good information because we're not even willing to put it on the table and talk about how skin color would sometimes translate into classism, the difference in terms of being black, but some people are up here and some people are down here. We aren't even willing to put that on the table to talk about how we have issues around that so we can all put what our issues on the table so we can move on with the work. So that's one way I know skin color affects, is a barrier to the work that we do in our community sometimes. And I'm speaking for, in the community that I work in.
But it also can be a plus. Because the person of Brenda's complexion, or for instance, appearance, because of the way I was looking when I went to youth court, made it easier for me to get what I want done. And a person of Brenda's complexion can get access to information and materials quicker than someone darker than she is, because they're not really acceptable because of their color.
And we were talking about mimicking, Connie, taking on ways that will get what you want.
That's how does it work?
Right.
Well, Mike made the statement earlier about Rosa Parks. That was based on Rosa Parks was a fair-skinned woman. She was articulate. So sometimes I think that it is to our advantage to use those things which are to our advantage. If it is around skin color, maybe I will send Brenda to the courthouse to get the documents versus sending Corey. I mean, aside from he's a male, and I know that in itself may be a barrier. I'm not saying that, that's the way to do it, but, we have to weigh both sides of it. It doesn't say that we buy into it, but you use things to your advantage.
But also, one of the things, the way I see it, I don't see it as in complexion. I see it as in who and what you know. Because most times, people, just because somebody might know your family, and then they might say, well, you so-and-so daughter. Well, you come on, I hope you do this to you. No problem. Then you might send somebody up there, so I don't feel like going to get it. Well, you go get this for me, but when the person gets there, they refuse to get the other person what it is that they want. And then just create a bigger problem. Then you're going to get mad and go up there asking why they give this to this person you sent. Then the next thing, what they would say, well, next time you call me ahead of time and let me know who you sent it. Then that person will be able to get information, bring it back to you. And that's another way to talk to them.
You gotta go through something. Well, I got to go through you to get what.
But I agree with that. You shouldn't have to go through that individual, but the way the system is set up, it's set up that way.
But we got to see, what we got to start seeing is black and white as a system of society, and stop separating ourselves from we got to stop separating. Whether I have a white friend to where we are as a people.
Yeah. You want to get people to hold it right there, and we'll come back and pick up where we left off. We're going to have a 30-minute break, and we would like for everybody to monitor themselves.
Be back at 3:40, please. It's 3:08 now.
And the tree or sheet that has been talked about, you can stop by there and
Okay.
can I have everybody? We want to start with the left off. We had been talking and we made a list of a lot of things that were carryovers and remnants from slavery and segregation period that affects or hinders our work that we're doing today. So we had begun to talk about how these things hinder our work today, because when we initially started, we didn't talk about how they hinder our work. We just listed the things, some things that did hinder our work tonight. So we want to talk a little bit now about how these things hinder or affect our work that we're doing today in the community. Corey.
When we was walking out, I don't know if everybody had heard me, is that we don't see the white culture as that system. When it was the plantation, you know, all white folks, the average one was somebody important, and they was a part of that system. Now we wanna get a few on the side, and we want to separate them. I mean, even though some of them are still good allies, and you know, do all kind of other things about themselves as individuals, maybe as a family, maybe as a group of people, but they still are part of that system. And we got to see the white culture, that's what it is, as the system, and that as long as you're black, you stay back, you know, that kind of stuff. We got to see it as the system, and that is not about, you know, just because we got a Clarence Thomas, we got somebody just last week, 2 weeks ago in the Fannie Mae Foundation. It's not about all those things. They still a part, they still black, and they still oppressed. And white folks, even they are friends, even though whoever they are, they're still in control. And they're part of that system.
Okay.
For me, sometimes understanding who has the power and where the power lies, and then recognizing that the black community is not really together as a whole, sometimes makes me resistant or hesitant to step out front sometimes when I know I need to step out front, because I'm not really sure who got my back in the community or where my support is. So to that extent, it hinders me, that understanding and recognizing those two things, both the power in the white community and the lack of it, and the lack of support or the lack of knowing where my people are in my community, sometimes hinders me, stops me and prevents me from going forward when I know I need to.
One of the things that can hinder me in my work, if I'm not familiar with certain things that I should be working on, then I would not get to speak on it, because I, for one, don't believe in telling nobody no lie about whatever it is that I'm supposed to be doing. And if I don't know, I'm gonna tell them I don't know, and you ask me no question about it, I would tell you what I think about it, but I would say this is not accurate, but you need to find out, or I would get back with you with information. But that would stop me from moving forward.
The step of inferiority on our culture, it hinders work, especially in our community, because people are not aggressive, and it's that fear, that step of inferiority gives them, it keeps them under this constant fear.
And we talked about the constant fear. We talked about the feeling of inferiority. So let's talk about how these things, we don't want to just rename them. You know, we want to talk about how they prevent us from doing what we need to do, or how they become a barrier to our work, how they affect our work. So you were saying, Brenda, based on the community having been divided, and you knowing that the community has not come together yet, then it brings about a certain degree of reluctance or a certain degree of fear on your part to do certain things, because you have not done the proper investigation, and therefore you don't know specifically who it is that is watching your back. Is that? if anybody is watching.
You know, I was with you, brother. I laughed because you put that fifth on my first message. You trying to make me say, okay, I got you. Okay, that's cool. That was it. That's cool.
Okay.
I'll tell you another way they can affect or hinder your work. When you got a group of people.
Now, okay, let's not talk about how it's made or how it can. Let's talk about how it is.
Okay.
Call it out.
You got a community gets together and go before a school board with a certain problem or a certain issue, right? You think you're on one accord, but all the community people not having the same and proper understanding, if fear is in them, they can easily be gotten off track by one simple comment or a question from a superintendent or a school board to say, okay, well now, we don't want to hear all of you. We just want your leader to speak, okay? If that person don't have the proper understanding and know that they shouldn't be singled out or isolated like that, that we're coming as a unified body, then you get to go ahead and push forward your agenda the way in which you want it to on your own course as opposed to being thrown out. So that's another way how fear has stopped or hindered us somewhat in our work.
Okay. When we started these things, we started with young folks talking about some things that that were carryovers from segregation and from slavery. So can we talk a little bit about how any and all of these things that you might want to choose to talk about affects the work that you're doing in your communities today? LT. You want to talk about that a little bit? How about you, baby? How about you? I want to talk about how some of these things that we got on the board affects our work in the community today. These carryovers, these remnants from slavery, remnants from segregation affects our work today. How you think? What you think?
Oh, I think it could vary in some way.
Okay. In what way? Give me an example.
Like I was saying about the older folks, they don't want to get their help to you if you think you're going to start some sort of the white folks. They don't want nothing to do with you.
That's too bad.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Old folks are still scared of white folks.
Exactly.
And if they think you're going to be challenging the white man's way of doing things, then they're scared to help you.
Another thing I find too is, just like he was saying, that the older people still have that fear. And then a lot of times people, they want things done in the community, for instance. They don't understand that it's all right to go and ask the mayor if you got a vacant lot somewhere and it need mowing. It's all right to go ask the mayor why this is, why this is not being mowed. But then they'll tell you, say, well, why don't you do that, Then you say, well, let's go up here and do this together. And then they'll say, well, no, I don't think I want to do that. I don't want to confront him, And you gotta stop right then and go through all the steps and try to help them understand that you can do that, You can ask him whatever you want to ask him. It's okay. And that hinders you too.
And one of the other things that hinders you is that you knowing that somebody has the information. And a lot of times people won't help you because they're scared that they may lose their job in the
That's
process.
true.
And then what you be trying to do is you be trying to talk to them in a way and telling them it'll be okay, but you understand that they're taking risks. But yet going still, they have to learn to step forward. So most times people tell you, so I tell you, but you meet me tonight, maybe 9 o'clock, but make sure you come along and I will see what I can do. But they still, what I'm saying, they'll run you around the bush before they decide to give you true information.
And they won't. A lot of times they won't.
Something else. that's a hindrance, that hinders us now from working with our young people. They listed that they're still getting hand-me-down materials for school and outdated stuff. A lot of work could be at a more advanced level or stage if we didn't have to do so much backing up and educating just on small stuff, on historical stuff. Because the materials are so outdated, so backdated, so unuseful. You have a lot, and then the teacher's not doing what they should be doing, period. But they don't have access to a lot of stuff that they should have. So even in the course of work we're doing, we still have to go back and educate them on some things that they should have already gotten or been exposed to if they had had the proper material. So that hinders us because that keeps us kind of moving slower, or like a step back from where we should be or could be if they had the right stuff.
You know what, and when you say that, you know, one of the other thing is, and I'm not criticizing what you just said, but in our work, we got to be clear about who the target is. Is teachers our problem? Is the principal our problem? And the reason why I'm going to say this, because you got to remember that they've been dealt the same hand these children are being dealt with. They've been taught to the same system, and that was don't rock the boat. They didn't learn nothing these schools need. So in other words, we got to be clear about who and what the focus is all about. Because a lot of times, I mean, they might be it as an individual. You know, that preacher might be it as an individual. But we gotta see above him or her in their capacity. Because we gotta remember that these people have been dealt with the same hand. And that's the reason why they got nothing to pass on. That's the reason why they can't be forceful. But like, say for instance, like these young people and ourselves who would take the time, the audacity to study in this kind of complex, this kind of setting, and learn this type of material. These are the people who are oftentimes the ones who rocking the boat. It's not, so we got to be careful who we beat up on, and not criticizing what you said, but we got to be careful who to beat up on, and if we're gonna beat them up, how bad we gonna beat them up? You see what I'm saying?
I can understand where Corey's coming from.
You don't know our system. I mean, in real.
No.
Because when I say teachers, specifically related to our community, these are white teachers. And they are taught, they know. They don't come in, they're not coming in as coming out of a system where they don't understand what they're doing. They come into our environment understanding what they're doing. So,
but then by the same token, we have some blacks as well. That when I say I buy in part of what he's saying is that to me it is a system that has been programmed within our mental thinking and our pattern of thought that this is the way it should be and ought to be. And I'm saying that it needs to be deprogrammed, where we take it from here and pass it on. You know, it's going to take time, I understand, but it all forms in the mind, and if they think that's the way it ought to be and should be, they're going to continue to do that until they see the better way. You know, it is going to continue to be like that. And that's a sad story.
You know, when we were in our role play, small group discussion, being that community that we're talking about, that white community, one of the things we said that we were going to do is to make sure that black folks did not get an education. We instituted a system to make sure that they didn't become educated. And we can see that same system existing right now. Or at least a lot of remnants of it carried over. Now, when we became who we really are, part of our responsibility is to look at how we are going to derail that system, introduce another kind of system, etc., that takes us to where we need to go. And I think part of the problem that we have in many instances as black people is we attempt to work in a system that is not meant to work. And if it's not meant to work, then it becomes very difficult in order to change that system completely around. Especially if we're not the ones that have gotten the power to control it. And if it is still dominated and controlled by those who put it in motion, then the same intent for all practical purposes is going to continue to go on. So it's a matter of us developing the strategy and the program of work as to how we become the ones that are empowered, who will control our own educational systems. And as we say, one of the things that we needed to do when we talk about an educational system is not look at it in the confines of the walls in which we traditionally have been looking at an educational system.
Let me see if I can clarify what I was saying. When we first started out, we was talking about the fact that at some course, when white folks helped black folks achieve what the system said that you can't do, in other words, slave masters had to treat their slaves a certain way. They couldn't let, if the rule was all had to be by sundown, then his slaves wasn't to be out walking around. In other words, he had to buy white folks, even in their particular role as today, even say a judge, he's got to send so many people down to the incarceration. He's got to find so many of them as a white judge. And if he don't, what's going to happen to him? He's going to be out of a job. So what I'm saying is that the inferiority is still in place in terms of you got to see this whole picture, that you got to lock up so many black folks. You know, that kind of thing. This particular teacher, she's got to be scrutinized because she's going to these meetings just like us, like we hearing this good news. They oftentimes sit in settings where they're hearing the news of how we got to keep control, and we sit in meetings that talks about how we need to gain control. They're sitting in meetings that talk about how do you keep control. So you must understand that.
In your classroom,
right.
What is it that you do to keep control in your class?
Exactly. And they're setting in audience which tell them.
You know what?
You see what I'm saying?
This is very interesting because I don't know where it was, Marshall County or where, but we was sitting around and we was talking and they was saying that, it was a private prison, was saying that, they promised them so many inmates.
That's right.
I'm serious right now. Oh, yeah. And that, their capacity is like 1,000, right? And anytime they fall down, they're looking for somewhere to bring these people in.
Thank you.
And the people that was on house arrest, if they messed up just a fraction, they would pull them in.
That's right.
Just to make room. And that's another industry that is growing in the Mississippi Delta. When kids get in trouble as early as second grade and up, or however it may be, they'll already label them as troubled kids. which is gonna automatically fill in to the penal system.
Yes.
You know, and people need to stop thinking, saying, well, you know, why are they building all these places? Well, it's cotton is not king in Mississippi anymore. Catfish is not king, but private prisons is. And that's the thing that, you know, you need to focus on too. And what my biggest thing was, as far as what hindered me sometimes, was that I was afraid to speak out. You know, if something was bothering me, I just let it blister within. But then that wasn't a good thing either, because I was hurting myself. And so I had to step out of that little box of being inferior to being confident in myself and saying, yes, what I say does make a difference. Whether you do anything about it or not, I'm going to let it be known. So my biggest thing was overcoming that inferiority complex that had been labeled from years back.
At this point, we're going to make the transition to the next thing that we're going to discuss, which is the foundation of understanding colonialism as the third stage of domination and control. Now, are you up to this? Are you up to it? You know it's awfully hot in here. I do not understand what's wrong with the air conditioning system. I do know we made a mistake and nobody unplugged. I didn't realize it was on. Nobody unplugged the heating system on that thing after lunch. So that's been putting out heat all afternoon. So we got, no, what? Well, I'm asking you if you're up to it because I think this is really important and I want us to get the hang of this. And you know, I want to know whether you're prepared to, you know, to make that. If you are, then it's worth making that, right? So are we ready to go? Can we do it? Can we?
We can try.
What? You want to try? Okay. Well, let's try it. All right. Here's where we leave. Here's where we make the transition. And we need to understand this because a lot of what we did and didn't do laid the foundation for what happened. The point that we're at in the 60s and the 70s is that something has happened in the black community that had not happened in the memory of people who were alive at that time. All over this country, from East Coast to West Coast, from Canada to Mexico, organizations were created in black communities and other communities of color as well, but we're focusing on black communities, which were designed to enable the community to work to change things based on the agendas that those communities established. At the same time, certain organizations which were either national or regional in nature emerged to provide leadership at the national level. You had organizations at the national level like the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Urban League. They were known as the Big Five. Well, I'm not going there yet. I'm not going there yet deliberately, okay? Because the unions had been around for a long time. relatively speaking. And the unions were badly split, because the unions that were loyal to George Meany, who was the head of the American Federation of Labor, and then became head of the AFL-CIO after they merged, was basically hostile. He was a doggone racist, to the core, to the bone, and he fought us tooth and nail, you know, all over the country. It was a tragedy. Now, a lot of the unions in the AFL-CIO were very supportive. Meany was never supportive, except when they beat him up so bad he had to be, as a last resort. So I'm not going there deliberately at this point. From the black community point of view, a capacity to make things happen or not happen had developed to a point that had not existed before in the memory of anyone who was around. Okay, it was alive at the time. This was a new and special period of time. Now, the white community, you know, put our thinking hats on, right? We're going over to the white point of view, not the black point of view. The white point of view is we are under attack. There is a serious threat. Our worst fears have been realized. What is developing is an independent black political movement based on organizations both national and local. And we have got to deal with this. Okay, we've got to deal with this. Now, there are different ways to deal with it. We've got to make some choices. Now, the way that the white community had dealt with this, basically, up to this point, was through a process of massive resistance to everything that